Welcome to Show Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for part 3 of a 138-part series as we travel poem by poem through You Get So Alone at Times That It Just Makes Sense by Charles Bukowski, as we are here in the series Alone with Bukowski. So why create an entire series just for poetry discussions? Because it's not just a poetry discussion, because in this series what we're doing is we're comparing each poem by poem through the Charles Bukowski collection, You Get So Alone at Times That It Just Makes Sense, with another poem in order that we might better understand Bukowski. Today, being the third poem after 1813 through 1883 and Red Mercedes, we are on Retired. And it reads as such. "Pork chops," said my father. "I love pork chops." And I watched him slide the grease into his mouth. "Pancakes," he said, "pancakes with syrup, butter, and bacon." I watched his lips heavy, wetted with all that. "Coffee," he said. "I like coffee so hot it burns my throat." Sometimes it was too hot, and he spit it out across the table. "Mashed potatoes and gravy," he said. "I love mashed potatoes and gravy." He jowled that in, his cheeks puffed as if he had the mumps. "Chili and beans," he said. "I love chili and beans," and he gulped it down and farted for hours loudly, grinning after each fart. "Strawberry shortcake," he said, "with vanilla ice cream. That's the way to end a meal." He always talked about retirement, about what he was going to do when he retired. When he wasn't talking about food, he talked on and on about retirement. He never made it to retirement. He died one day while standing at the sink filling a glass of water. He straightened like he'd been shot. The glass fell from his hands, and he dropped backwards, landing flat, his necktie slipping to the left. Afterwards, people said they couldn't believe it. He looked great, distinguished white sideburns, pack of smokes in his pocket, always cracking jokes, maybe a little loud, and maybe with a bit of a bad temper, but all in all a seemingly sound individual. Never missing a day of work. We're going to look at that poem side by side with My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke. My Papa's Waltz. "The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt." Invocation of the Father, and they're both sort of rough fellas. And I think one of the big things that stands out when looking at each of these poems is the form itself. Bukowski goes with couplets until that second page of the poem when it becomes a standard Bukowski narrative poem. Anytime you see couplets, it's interesting to ask the question, why? What does a couplet represent? A couple, a pair. Is this he and I until that second page where father dies and he was no more? And then, in that instance, the form goes off the rails and becomes more expressive. This seems like a very orderly fella, the father in Bukowski's poem. And the moment he dies, the poem becomes more expressive, more free, more liberal, more individual. Roethke, on the other hand, has 4 stanzas of ABAB standardized poetry. It's nice. It rhymes. It's very quaint. These are reflections on the memory of the father himself. Bukowski's poem is a list, bullet by bullet, until it isn't. That poem is run by the father until the father is no more. Roethke's poem is loving and simplistic all the same, all the way through. Loving and simplistic, but is it? We'll get to that a little bit later. Each father, the father in each of these poems, is connected with work on one hand and with vice on the other. Bukowski's father is food and fat and coffee and go, go, go. And he never missed a day of work. Very linear, very orderly. But hey, baby, you gotta fuel the machine because the machine's gotta go. Gotta go, go, go. And the father in this poem seems to go, go, go. Roethke's opening stanza mentions whiskey. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. The final stanza, bringing the pairing together, his hand was with a palm caked hard by dirt. Caked hard by dirt. It's a hard-working fella. But there's a very large difference here, and I'm wondering if you've noticed it yet. Roethke's poem is very sentimental. It's very Hallmark. It's very cute, very quaint, very la-ti-da. The rhyme scheme sort of gets you into a waltz with the poem. This is a poem about a nightly ritual with a loving father. Or it's about child abuse. Is that a plane crashing outside? Jesus Christ. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. Pretty drunk. But I hung on like death. Hung on like death? What is going on? Hanging on like death, fearing for one's life, perhaps? Sorry about that. Jesus. We romped on until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. Romping on until the pans slide from the kitchen shelf, that does not sound like a la-ti-da waltzing. That sounds like a whooping. And if anyone's been in that situation, do you remember the look on Mom's face? Not a happy one. Would Mom have a happy look on her face if it was just a loving father committing the nightly ritual to get the child off to bed? Maybe a little bit better than a frowning countenance, a countenance which could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Sounds like a boxing fracture. You've got one knuckle that sticks out further than the rest. So that is the point of contact when striking something solid that's going to get the brunt of the load from that strike. That is not uncommon. It's called a boxer's fracture for a reason. You get it from punching somebody in the face. Every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. Could be a child standing on his or her father's shoes, dancing along. Could also be when you're getting a whooping and Dad screws up. Doesn't aim quite right because of the whiskey on his breath. You beat time on my head? sounds like there could be a different thing going on here than simply a nightly ritual, getting little Boopki off to bed. Either way, in this situation, the speaker loved the father, it seems. Either loved the father and this nightly ritual and was willing to write this poem about it, or loved the father enough that the speaker was willing to lie away the abuse suffered in childhood. This often happens in tales of abuse. Dad was a little rough, but, he loved me. I don't know that I would have become the person I became if I didn't just get a whooping once in a while. All of these sorts of things. In Bukowski, where does our speaker exist in Bukowski? Speaker doesn't really exist here. I watched him. I watched his lips. That's about all of the speaker's eye that we get. That is all of the speaker's intent that we get. So how does this better help us know the poetry of Bukowski? This lacking of the eye in his poem about the father. The stray cat roams the streets early in life. That sense of lonerdom that one cannot help but absorb through the lines of Bukowski, it begins at onset. This is a poem existing somewhere early in the formation of the writer. And this sentiment, at least, this sentiment of killing the father or letting him kill himself. Why? We don't need him anyway. We're a loner. We're off on our own. The title here is Retired. That's about the father. The father never made it to retirement. The father only talked about retirement. And we don't even hear the father talk about retirement until halfway through when the speaker tells us his father or her father talked about retirement. Is that what's going on there? Or is it the sense of orderliness that retires with the death of the father? That's all I've got for this episode. This was Retired by Charles Bukowski and My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke, episode 3 of 138 as we travel through You Get So Alone at Times that it just makes sense in our series Alone with Bukowski. I hope to have you back next time for the poem Working It Out, which is the 4th poem in the collection.